Welcome to the final week of this summer session of World History from 1945 to the present. I hope you've enjoyed the lectures so far. I've gotten more and more comfortable doing them, and we're in topics now that I have more comfort in doing when I put these lectures together. The Cold War topic was always very difficult without having a good World War II lecture preceding it that kind of built it up. So that kind of made the beginning a bit of a rocky start, but I think everything else has been very, very good. Communist China is certainly very interesting. French decolonization in Algeria and Vietnam, Tunisia and Morocco. Then we have Afghanistan and the various wars in Afghanistan that are being fought and were being fought and still fought to this day. And now this brings us to Iran, a country that is in the headlines quite often now, but has a very long and illustrious past and history in its own right. Now, this is kind of an odd little quasi-lecture that I'm giving. Both lectures are being filed underneath what is called the Iranian section, but not all of them deal specifically with Iran. This particular lecture, which is video 1 of 2, this is going to deal with Iran exclusively and how Iran interacts with its neighbors. The second show, which will take us to the very end of this class, will be Iran in concert with Iraq, the United States, and the war on terror. So we're going to get a lot of Iraq as well as a lot of Iran in the next video. And that's why I call this entire unit Iran, Iraq, and Wars in the Persian Gulf. This particular lecture is on Iran, specifically the coups, the revolution, and the wars that come after and beyond. So let's talk about Iran, this mysterious Middle Eastern country that has been causing us headaches for the last couple of years. And we hear about them quite often in our news reports. Who are they exactly? How do they come to be where they are today? And I think that is ultimately the important center foundation of this lecture. Iran is in the Middle East, but it's at the dead end of the Middle East. Iraq is kind of the center portion of the Middle East over here. Here's Turkey to the north. Here's Azerbaijan, which is quasi-European. There's Kuwait and there's Saudi Arabia. But Iran, really only the western part of Iran, is part of the true Middle East. The rest of Iran, going further and further to the west, is part of Asia. Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, these countries. These are all part of Asia. So Iran is going to straddle the Asian and Arab worlds. The people of Iran are not going to really identify as being Asian or Arab. They're going to identify being much different than these other two groups. They're going to call themselves Irani. And there's a very specific history to what it means to be Irani. This is a very large country. Iraq is a very large country. But Iran, as you can see, is more than twice the size of Iraq. Iran has a population of nearly 90 million, or nearly 85 to 90 million, is 80 to 83. Very large country, 630,000 square miles. Like Afghanistan, its languages are not going to be Arabic. Arabic will be involved. People will speak Arabic to a certain extent, but its primary language, its primary spoken language, can be referred to as Iranian, but it's officially known as Farsi. Arabic is used in Iran the way it's used in Afghanistan and some of these other Islamic-dominated countries outside the Arab world. It is used specifically for the reading and interpretation of the Quran. The official religion of Iran is Islam, but the difference between Iran and Afghanistan and Iran and its neighbors is quite striking. The majority of Islamic practitioners in the world are Sunni Islam. Sunni Muslims dominate the Islamic world. That includes Malaysia, Africa, the Middle East, towns in Tennessee. It doesn't matter. Any place where there are Muslims, about 90% of Muslim practitioners are Sunni. About 95 to 97% of Afghanis are Sunni Muslims. The majority of Saudis are Sunni Muslims. But Iran is going to be part of a very small minority but it's the second largest branch of Islam in the world. It's going to be called Shia or Shiaism, or you may have heard the term Shiite. These are going to be the dominant practitioners of Iran. These are also going to be the dominant practitioners of Iraq, because Iraq and Iran, as you can see by this previous page, and I'll show you another one, Iraq and Iran are part of this larger world, and they're very close neighbors to each other, so there's going to be a lot of cultural spillover. And so while many people in the Middle East are going to be Sunni, Iran and most people in Iraq are going to be Shia. And what are the differences between Shia Islam and Sunni Islam? Well, there are a number of them. I don't want to get into the smallest minutia, but the main difference between Shia Islam and Sunni Islam really relates to who controls the church, for lack of a better word. Sunnis believe, the largest body of Muslims in the world believe, that when Muhammad died, his successors allowed for various local leaders and local imams and clerics to lead religious to dictate religious law locally. That Muhammad did not have a designated successor. That all Islamic clerics and all peoples were free to interpret the Quran as they see fit in various localities. It's a very localized type of approach. In fact, one could almost make it liken it to Protestantism. When Protestantism separated from the Catholic Church, they were not following the dictates of a pope or some kind of bishop. Instead, they were allowing local ministers and local leaders to kind of make their own interpretations of the Bible themselves. Shia Islam is a minority, but it's the second largest group of Islam in the world, making up about 10 to 15% of the entire Muslim population. Its dominant seats of power are in Iran, with a dominant majority in Iraq as well. Shia believe that Muhammad did in fact designate a successor before his death, and that his successor was in fact his uncle and nephew, and that these two were more or less prophets in their own right. And so all interpretation of the Quran cannot be done by some random run-of-the-mill Muslim. They can only be done by clerics who are the successors of the prophet's uncle and the prophet's nephew. So there's almost a lineage quality here. Also, Shia believe that there is a prophet that will come again, and that will more or less judge the living and the dead, almost like a messianic type of religion. Shiaism isn't technically considered a messianic, Islam is not considered a messianic religion, but Shiism has qualities of a messianic religion because they believe that there is a prophet that will return and become the next prophet to interpret the Great Quran and to judge the living and the dead. This is very similar to the Christian interpretation of Christ returning for the second coming. Sunni Islam does not believe in a messianic second coming. They don't believe in that. So these are key differences, and they are differences that are worthy enough to have these groups always at war with each other. Keep in mind Sunniism and Shiaism as we go through this lecture and especially the next lecture, because it's going to become important when it comes to the relationship between Iran and Iraq. So just keep that in mind. So this is the Persian Empire in 500 BC. At one time, Iran was the center of a great empire called the Persian Empire. Modern day Iran would be somewhere around here. And they pretty much controlled everything over to Turkey. This was all part of the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire would eventually collapse and then rebuild and collapse and rebuild again. And there would be a large Sunni empire that would come to dominate this western portion here called the Ottoman Empire. And I don't have a picture of them, but the Ottoman Empire are dominantly Sunni, and the Persian Empire are dominantly Shia. And this is one of the reasons why Iraq has a large Shia population. It's because they're right next to Iran and because Persia had conquered them. All of these countries certainly have Shia minorities, but it is Iran and Iraq that have the Shia majority because they were the heart of the Shia world. But let's fast forward several hundred years to modern Iran. Iran develops from an empire and transitions into a constitutional monarchy, the way Afghanistan develops into a constitutional monarchy. Well, Iran, like Afghanistan, has a close relationship to the British. Whereas the British attempted to conquer Afghanistan several times, their relationship with Iran is a little bit more complicated. The British certainly try to conquer Iran, but they can't quite do it. But they do have enough power to dictate many of the terms that Iran has to deal with in terms of its trade. So Iran is able to garner favor with the British by reconstituting their very weak and collapsing empire into a constitutional monarchy, and very much in the same vein as the constitutional monarchy of Afghanistan, as you recall. Here's a picture of the monarch of Iran. This gentleman is named Reza Shah Khan, and he's part of I haven't said this for a while, forgive me, the Pahlavi dynasty. The Pahlavi dynasty. Reza Shah Khan is in charge of the Pahlavi dynasty, and this is the dynasty that rules through 1941 and tries to make a comeback again in the 1950s and 1960s. Specifically, though, Reza Shah Khan, his specific ruling dates are going to be the 1920s and the 1940s. You can see that he's dressed very similar to a European nobleman, a European leader, very French, but mixtures of British styles here. And the constitutional monarchy of Iran is going to be modeled directly after the constitutional monarchy of Great Britain, with a king as well as a prime minister. The British love this, and they put their whole military and trade support behind this Iranian monarch. So while Iran is an independent monarchy, they are kind of the client states of a larger British Empire. They're not formally part of the British Empire, they are independent, but they are in close cooperation with the British Empire. Reza Shah Khan is very much similar to a British liberal or a Western European type of individual. He does not want to see a backwards type of country wearing the styles of clothing that would have been popular during the Persian Empire, such as a turban, for example, or using the title of Shah. He does use the title of Shah, but he also uses the title of King. He wants to see westernization, similar to the monarchs of Afghanistan, the liberalization of the economy. He leans a little bit more towards socialism as well, but that's not too surprising because monarchies usually have larger state-centered economies. So socialism is not too terribly surprising. But he also advocates other aspects of liberalization as well: individual rights, individual freedoms, individual property ownership, individual security, and certain degrees of rights for women and minorities. He is proudly Islamic, and he is a Shia, and this is a Islamic kingdom. But he advocates for elements of secularism, and he suppresses elements of traditional secular beliefs, the more tribal, primitivistic religious expressions that we saw in Afghanistan and the countryside. He desires a modern Iranian military, and he desires close partnerships with international corporations and conglomerates. So he wants to transform Iran into a modern state. And he is, for the most part, quite successful. Although this is a modern state that doesn't benefit all of his people the same way as it benefits the upper half of Iranian society. Now, the reason why the British have such an interest in Iran in the first place is because Iran is a major oil producer. There are large oil fields and refineries in Iran, and the British want to get this oil for themselves. The British are the largest empire in the world at this point, and they need oil to control the world. They need oil for their battleships. They need oil for their tanks. They need oil to control all of these lands that they dominate. And they form a large company, a state-sponsored, sort of quasi-state, quasi-private corporation called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which is later renamed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. And we most famously know it today as the British Petroleum Company, or just simply known as BP. So this company is formed in 1900, and it desires to control most of these oil fields. And we're simply going to refer to it as AOC, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, or AOC. AOC is mainly dominated by foreign investors from Great Britain, but there are a few Americans as well. And they're able to broker and negotiate rights to control the Iranian oil fields from the Iranian monarch in what is referred to infamously as the 60-year lease. And this is really a demonstration of British authority in its colonies or quasi-colonies, how it's able to flex its muscles against these peoples, even when it comes to their own natural resources. The British negotiate what is a 60-year lease for their universal control over these Iranian oil fields. And what they do in 1914, just before World War I, the British secure access to these Iranian oil fields. And one of the reasons why they do this is because they sense that there's going to be a war against Germany. But they secure access and complete harvesting rights, oil rights to these oil fields for 60 years. And this is the caveat. The money that they negotiate for these leases in 1914 and then renegotiate again in 1933, this rate would remain the same. So in 1950 and in 1960, the amount of money that the British are paying to have access to the Iranian oil fields is the exact same amount they negotiated in 1933. So even if oil prices went up considerably and oil became more and more valuable, they paid the exact same market rate as they did in 1933. Now, in 1933, this was a pretty good deal if you were a member of the Iranian populace. The British paid a decent rate, you made money, you worked in the oil fields, and there was trickle down, for lack of a better word, of money throughout the country where people could use to open shops, markets, schools, museums, all the great things that Western society is known for. But by the 1950s, after World War II, this is a scant amount of money, and that oil is worth a fortune. And there are people who desperately want more money and desperately need more money from the British, and people who want access to these oil fields. The Iranians want to eventually break this deal in order to allow other people come in to invest in oil infrastructure, roads, and other things, and pay a much higher, much fairer rate. But the British are not going to be in favor of this. The oil doesn't really even go to Iran. The oil is mainly diverted to British interests in the West, specifically their military, and also some of the leftover excess is sold to the United States and Canada as well. So while the Iranians do get money trickling down, it's not to the same extent as the money that you're getting, say, in Great Britain. There are people in Great Britain who work in directly with the oil company here or in secondary, what we call ancillary markets related to the oil company, such as shipping, who are making much more money from AOC than the Iranians are themselves. And this becomes a point of contention for the Iranian people. Here's a picture of an Iranian oil field, I believe circa 1935, maybe 1940. After World War II, like in Algeria, like in Afghanistan, like in so many other places I haven't been able to cover, like India and Pakistan, there is a wave of nationalism and a desire to break down these colonial ties. In the case of Iran, they're not technically a true colony, but they're really under the thumb of the British Empire. And everybody knows that the king and the monarch, despite the fact that they're not bad people, are under the thumb of the British monarchy and the British colonial corporate interests. And so there's a bit of a democratic revolution in Iran in the 1950s. Iran will remain a monarchy, but the prime minister is going to gain more and more power, the same way that the prime minister in Great Britain has started to gain more and more power after World War II, to the point where the prime minister really is the head of the government, and the monarch is only the head of state. So Reza Shah and his children, they will become the succeeding kings and shahs of Iran, but they're really going to be there symbolically, the way that the British monarch is today. The Prince Philip and Prince Charles and the Duke of Edinburgh and people like that you may have heard about with the recent royal weddings. They don't really have a lot of direct control over the government anymore. They have symbolic control over the government. The person that's going to come in and have direct control over the government will be a man by the name of Mohammad Mossadegh. And he's prime minister of Iran only from 1951 to 1953. He's the first Iranian leader educated in Europe. He's educated specifically in France and Switzerland at the academies of Paris and the academies of Neuchâtel. And he is going to become a force to be reckoned with in Iran's transformation from a kind of quasi-colony slash monarchy into what he hopes to have a modern state. And you can see over here on the right, this is a picture of him. He was Times Man of the Year in 1952. He's the leader of a political movement in Iran called the National Front, or the INF. And the Iranian National Front is not too terribly different from what becomes the Republic of Afghanistan under Mohammad Darid Khan in Afghanistan in the 1970s before the communists overthrow him. Mossadegh is very interested in transforming Iran into a country similar to France or Germany or Great Britain. He's a strong advocate of what's called social democracy, meaning that he believes that the government should not benefit the wealthy, the government should benefit the poorest people on up. He is a Muslim, but he is an advocate of secular liberalism. He's meaning a government similar to what we have in the United States or what we have in Great Britain or what we have in France. So he draws on his Muslim heritage, and he certainly believes in it, but he wants secular laws, secular authority. He wants secular courts. He wants private property ownership. He wants individual rights and liberties, very similar to akin what the Algerian rebels desired and what the people who were in charge of the Republic of Afghanistan wanted. He wants the same thing. Like his counterpart in Afghanistan, he advocates for economic socialism, certain aspects of the redistribution of wealth, a highly regulated government, a government in which corporations can flourish, but also a government in which corporations are controlled by the government and kept from overrunning the government with their own personal power. It makes a lot of sense. As you recall, AOC, which is a quasi-state company in Great Britain, it pretty much has the control of all of Iran's oil fields. And so he wants to make sure that these companies, though they can invest in Iran and they can promote Iran and make money in Iran and make money for Iran, he advocates towards regulation and certain aspects of economic socialism. Though bear in mind again, as a Muslim himself and as a country that is predominantly Muslim and very religious, they will never embrace, not even come close to embracing, Marxism or communism. And I want you to keep that in mind. That is a very, very, very important point. Mossadegh and his followers in the Iranian National Front and the vast majority of Iranians would never embrace Marxism and communism. And that's an important point for the reasons that I'm going to mention further in this slideshow. Just want to show you some pictures of Iranian people during the era of Mossadegh. So this is a picture of a women's basketball team at this time. And notice again, this is Iran. This may be a Muslim country, but unlike what we typically think about as a Muslim country, it was considered a very progressive, very Western country. So these are women. They're dressed in skirts. They're dressed in gym clothes, workout clothes for this time. Their hair is done up. They're not covering themselves. So you can see their arms and their necks. Their legs are, the skirts are cut above the knee. And look, they're wearing Converse. They're wearing Converse shoes. So this is a very modern Western style country under the control of Mossadegh. And still the Shah, he's there, but he's just kind of off to the side right now. Mossadegh will institute a series of progressive reforms to bring Iran into the modern 20th century and to try and line it up to the interests similar to Canada, Great Britain, France, Germany, and the United States. So he's going to want the things that those countries have. And I have a list of them over here. So these are the great progressive reforms between 1950 and 1953 that Mossadegh advocated for when he was a member of the parliament and eventually the prime minister. Things like Social Security, workman's comp, labor unions, ending the practice of feudalism where the elites own land and people are bound to work on that land, public works projects like highways and dams and power plants, redistributing the wealth through various forms of tax reform, improved urban and rural housing for the poor. That's part of the redistribution of wealth. Irrigation and agricultural improvements to yield more crops so he can feed his people and grow the Iranian population. Public health reform kind of goes hand in hand with that too, to treat illnesses. And the most controversial of them all, these are not particularly controversial. We have them here in our country through the various ones. We have labor unions, we have Medicare, we have Medicaid, we have various aspects of redistribution of wealth, although we don't call it that in this country because it's not very popular to do so. But we have that in France and Great Britain. Maybe national health care, for example. But what makes Mossadegh very controversial is his nationalization of the Iranian oil fields. And these would be the same oil fields owned by AOC, the same oil fields the British are heavily invested in and are getting quite a bit of their oil at a bargain rate. And the Americans are getting left oil from AOC as well. And this is going to make him very controversial. And this is going to lead eventually to his removal from office. But in the meantime, he nationalizes the oil fields in 1951. He brings considerable amount of wealth and improvement to Iranian society, and he is referred to as a man of the people. He is truly a man of his people. He's very popular. Unfortunately, this will not last. And this is unfortunately for a number of reasons that are going to include the British and the United States. So what happens is, while Mossadegh may be very, very popular, not every politician in the history of the world is going to be 100% popular in their country. There's still going to be people who don't like them. There's going to be corporatists in Iran who have close ties to the British and the Americans that don't like what Mossadegh is doing with the oil fields. And there are Islamic extremists as well, fundamentalists who live in the countryside who don't like this increased secularism under Mossadegh. Mossadegh is still a Muslim, but his form of government, his view of the world is decidedly secular and very much informed by the British and the French and the Americans. But we're in the 1950s now, and this is the height of the Cold War, so the United States is trying desperately to control communism through Truman's practice of containment. And as you recall from Truman's document, he is going to oppose communism on every single front and try to oppose socialism wherever it may happen to exist. The British are very upset with what Mossadegh had done with the oil fields, as are the Americans. The Americans are a little bit more skeptical and hesitant to comment on the matter, but the British are absolutely infuriated, and the British are our allies. With the nationalization of the Iranian oil fields, Mossadegh is demanding that the British buy oil directly from Iran, not from AOC, not from this sort of quasi-British public-private company. Mossadegh doesn't want to do that anymore because he feels that the Iranians were getting more or less taken advantage of in their national resources and not getting paid a fair rate. And the British were refusing to renegotiate those leases. So Mossadegh nationalizes the oil fields to try to push and force the British to renegotiate those oil leases, which they refuse to do. The British are able to convince the Americans that this nationalization effort was part of a Soviet plot to pull Iran into the communist sphere of influence and make Iran into a communist state. Now, many in the United States government are actually skeptical of this, but there are very hardlining Cold Warriors, as we would call them, very anti-Soviet politicians, people like McCarthy. People like McCarthy, people like a little bit later Ronald Reagan would kind of fall into this view, although McCarthy was much more belligerent. and Truman himself, and later on Eisenhower, although they are much more cautious. But they see what the British have to say, and they believe that there is something afoot here, that the Soviets must be up to something. Mossadegh doesn't help his cause because he does cultivate a good relationship with the Soviet Union, but in his defense, the Soviet Union is looming directly north of him. So, like with Afghanistan, it's in his best interest to try and cultivate relationships between all of the world powers: Britain, the United States, France, and the Soviet Union. So the United States, they become increasingly concerned that they may lose access to their oil. So remember, the British needed oil for their large navies and armies during the height of their power in the 19 teens, 20s, and 30s. The Americans are now the superpower of the world, and they cannot even risk the influence of the Soviet Union, if there is any, infiltrating Iran and gaining control of those oil interests and robbing Americans of their access to the oil. And so the Americans, specifically the CIA, MI6 under the British, and some Iranian collaborators, specifically the Iranian monarch, Reza Shah, the son of the original Reza Shah, they orchestrate an operation called Operation Ajax, a top secret overthrow of the Iranian government, the legitimate democratically elected Iranian government headed by Mohammad Mossadegh, the man pictured here on the right. The coup was mainly designed and coordinated by Andrew Dulles. I'm sorry, Mossadegh is on the previous page. This is Andrew Dulles, who is very anti-communist and wants to stave and destroy and cut off communism and its potential spread into Iran, what is called containment, which would be used again by the Americans during the Vietnam War, and was also used at this time in the 1950s during the Korean War. When Mossadegh is overthrown, Mossadegh is convicted of high treason against Iran and the Iranian people and placed under house arrest, where he would eventually die in the 1950s. The Shah, who had been in power technically as the head of state, but delegated all of his power to the prime minister, is going to be installed as the absolute ruler of Iran. So rather delegating this power to a prime minister, the Shah, who for the last 20 years had been more or less a playboy, who just sort of cruised around Iran, attending ceremonial functions, funding schools and scholarships, and Reza Shah has a bit of a playboy reputation about him. He's going to take over and become the absolute ruler of Iran after the disposition of Mossadegh in 1953. So the United States, the British, with some Iranian collaborators, are responsible for the removal of a democratically elected leader of Iran because of his decision to nationalize the Iranian oil fields out of fear that he may form a stronger alliance with the Soviet Union. And bear in mind, Iran is more heavily Muslim, and Mossadegh was Muslim himself. So this fear that he would become communist is actually quite unfounded. But at the time, the United States convinced themselves that this was potentially the case, and they overthrew the government. And this is going to sow the seeds for a lot of problems that we have with Iran later on, and that we still have to this very day. Mohammad Reza Shah is the son of the previous Reza Shah. He's part of the Pahlavi dynasty, and he's the Iranian head of state from here on out, and he's in charge of the Iranian government. Here's a picture of him and his absolutely lovely wife, who is a movie star and actress in Iran, and who does movies both in the Iranian film industry as well as in the French and European film industry as well. He's considered a bit of a playboy. He's known to have had multiple wives and have had multiple affairs with some of the most beautiful and illustrious, powerful women in Iran at this time. I liken him, and not to be insulting to people who remember his memory, think of him as a Kennedy. Affairs with people like Marilyn Monroe, beautiful actresses. He's very similar to that. That is his lifestyle. But he has that lifestyle while he's still king, but before he's really in charge of anything. He's not really in charge of anything. But after the coup, he is placed in charge of the entire government, and he has to figure out a way to operate it. Now, during the era that Mossadegh is in charge, along with the Iranian front, he supports many of Mossadegh's reforms. He's considered, in many ways, a liberal progressive. He demands secularism to a certain extent. As you can see, a man that lives by this lifestyle is not going to be a fundamentalist. He demands increased secularism, like his father. Uh, he demands more liberal and progressive reforms, and he even advocated the nationalization of the oil fields under Mossadegh. But the CIA and MI6 are able to convince him through the threat of house arrest and deposition and possibly trial to join them in removing Mossadegh from power. In exchange, he would be given complete control over the Iranian government, and he would be given more autocratic authority in his administration to dictate what he wanted to get done. So although Iran would continue to have a prime minister and a constitution and a parliamentary monarchy, it's more symbolic. Whatever he wants to do, he's able to get it done. And this is actually written into the Iranian constitution after the coup in 1953. He is able to have the final say on all laws that are created at this time. Between 1954 to 1979, Mohammad Reza Shah becomes increasingly autocratic and oppressive to his people. Now, on one hand, he continues the secularization and the progressive reforms under his two predecessors, Mossadegh and his father, Reza Shah. He would desire a highly secularized government, but one that's in keeping and in concert with and in total loyalty with the British and the Americans. But he just has full control over the Iranian government. This is called the White Revolution. There are some good things and bad things about this. Some good things is that Mohammad Reza Shah, like his father and like his predecessor, increased spending tenfold. He actually still has a relatively secular, semi-socialist government where money is shared between different classes, and there are taxes and regulation, similar to a Western European country. It's just that the British have taken back the oil fields. The White Revolution, though, saw massive investment in agriculture to develop greater agricultural output in order to feed more Iranians, and to try and modernize the modern Iranian military and Iranian educational apparatus, specifically K through 12 and university system. But unfortunately, at the same time that that's going on, we see stagnation in oil markets and agricultural markets, and there's an issue with currency inflation. So while this is going on, the White Revolution is attempting to not only increase the output and increase the modernization of the country, but try to combat this stagnation that is hindering the growth of the Iranian economy. This actually makes Mohammad Reza Shah look like a very good man. And if we just left it at that, he wouldn't be such a bad ruler. Unfortunately, though, he becomes increasingly autocratic and dictatorial. He takes large sums of money from the national treasury and uses it to increase what is called the family purse. All royal families have some sort of family purse that is given to them by the national treasury. He increases the family purse for the Shah family, spends lavishly on himself and his wife and his children at the expense of the state. And while people continue to become poorer and poorer despite his best efforts, he becomes wealthier and wealthier and wealthier and just looks wealthier. People see the Shah and they see these pictures of him and his wife, and they see somebody, despite the fact that he's very autocratic and he's very dictatorial, but he is trying to help his people. But when they see him do these things, they see him as a growing traitor and alien among his own people. Anybody that opposed him was arrested and deported. Most people were not killed under the Shah directly, but they were arrested and deported. These could be clerics with traditional Islamic beliefs. These could be communists. These could be people who just supported Mossadegh. Any of these people were removed. If you opposed the Shah, you were removed in one form or another. And there was a growing belief among these clerics, these traditionalists, and even among communists that Iran was nothing more than a puppet state to the United States. And even worse, it was a puppet state that bowed down to Israel. And this could not be tolerated. This was not necessarily true, because Iran never got along well with Israel, though it tried to form better relationships between Israel and Iran during this period. But they were not puppets to Israel, and there was still a lot of tension between Iran and Israel. But Iran was, in many ways, a quasi colony to the West. And this feeds increasing anger and resentment to the Shah and his family throughout the 1960s and into the late 1970s. Notice again, under this period, like in Afghanistan, Iranian culture is not going to be what we think of Iranian culture today. It's going to be very Western and very European. These are Iranian women in an Iranian catalog. And as you can see, they're showing off their legs, they're showing off their arms, their necks, they're dressed in very European style clothing. It's very sexual by comparison to what you might think of Iran today or the Middle East as a whole today. And this makes a lot of people very uncomfortable in Iran, especially the traditionalists and the much stricter and more traditional fundamentalist Islamic clerics. Mohammad Reza Shah also had a secret weapon up his sleeve, and that was a group known as Savak. Savak was the name of the Iranian secret police, and they were armed and trained and put in place by the CIA, as well as, rumor has it, the Israeli Mossad, which is the Israeli version of the CIA. These were the armed bodyguards and the intelligence apparatus of the Shah. They were his eyes and ears. If you resisted him, if you commented against him, if you painted a portrait, created a piece of art, issued a speech, wrote a book, if you did something that offended the Shah in some way, Savak would come knocking on your door. And when Savak paid a visit, it meant they were either going to intimidate you, rough you up, or make you disappear. I don't know if this gentleman over here, pictured on the right, what happened to him, but this is Savak around him. And if he's being taken into custody like this, chances are he was going to be either tortured, jailed, deported, or made to disappear. So this is a very dangerous and very aggressive security force that was unfortunately bought for, trained, and supported by the CIA, the British MI6, and the Israeli security forces. Here's another picture of Savak dressed in military clothing for a formal parade. That leads us to the revolution of 1979, and this is where things are really going to pick up and change. The revolution is going to come about because there is absolute distaste and dissatisfaction for the Shah and his tyrannical and increasingly autocratic form of government, specifically Savak. People have absolutely had it with Savak. They do not want to live under this secret police society any longer. They are also angry with the Western powers because they view the United States and they view the British as being totalitarian, authoritarian rulers, turning Iran into a puppet state. They're controlling Iran's politics, their economics, their livelihood, their culture. And because the United States and Great Britain are in strong support of Israel, they see Iran and the Shah being transformed into puppet states that are going to bow and do what Israel whatever says. That's not entirely true, but they are seen. And again, Savak was partially trained and supported by the Israeli intelligence and security force. So there is some truth to this, but there also is a lot of rumor and hearsay. But during this revolution, during this very hectic period, rumor, hearsay, fact, and fiction mean very little. And people are becoming increasingly angry and upset and desire something else from their government. And this leads to the creation of the rise of an Islamic fundamentalist group. A lot of these people are disaffected with the Shah, who's increasingly secular and increasingly Western and also very corrupt, both by rumors and by reality. He was very corrupt. He was bought out by the U.S. and the British left and right. That's how he was able to afford so much. So there's increasingly interest in Islam, and specifically traditionalist fundamentalist Islam. Not the Islam of Mossadegh, but the Islam of people like the Taliban, though not necessarily the same. But while some groups are gravitating towards Islamic traditionalism and fundamentalism, there are groups in Islam in Iran. I'm sorry, there's too many words with I's here. There are groups in Iran gravitating more towards leftism, such as communism, and they're going to form a very bizarre alliance. Leftists in Iran who are in favor of the reforms of Mossadegh or are in favor of the reforms that would be more communist or socialist are going to join with religious theocrats like the man pictured over here, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who is a very, very right-leaning, right-wing religious authoritarian who is an advocate of traditionalist Islam. And they're going to form a very uncomfortable alliance and overthrow the Shah in 1979 and try to remove as much American and Western influence as possible. Eventually, the Ayatollah Khomeini is able to use his power and authority and his, believe it or not, his charisma to unify these religious traditionalists and fundamentalists to overthrow and purge the leftists from their ranks. And eventually, in 1979, they create what is now known today as the Islamic Republic of Iran, which was first governed by the Ayatollah Khomeini. Here's another picture during the Iranian Revolution of 1979, also known as the Islamic Revolution of 1979. And here's a gentleman holding up a picture of the Ayatollah. The Ayatollah was very famous for putting portraits of himself all over Iran, especially in the nation's capital of Tehran. So this would be the first of many portraits posted glorifying the Ayatollah as a leader and savior of his people. So the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is the government that's still in charge today, was headed by the Ayatollah Khomeini. And the Ayatollah Khomeini and the rest of the Islamic clerics that were involved in sort of creating Islamic law and running this Islamic government vowed to purge corruption from all corners of Iran, get rid of all of Western influence, these brothels, houses of prostitution, elements of capitalism, elements of communism, elements of atheism. Remember, in the eyes of Islamic fundamentalists, all of that is considered one and the same. And to go back to a very traditional set of country that was run by traditional Islamic values. Although, to be fair, Iran was never really run with the strict Islamic values that the Ayatollah Khomeini had in mind. This was simply his interpretation of what is called a strict fundamentalist version of Islam. The Ayatollah also sought to improve living conditions, so he's not merely interested in fostering Islam. He is interested in helping his people, but with a lot of strings attached. The people he's going to help are people who fall into his category of specific Islamic practitioner. He denounces the United States in particular as the great Satan of the world, and orchestrates an attack on the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. The leftists and the right-wing revolutionaries will continue to clash over their different worldviews before this right-wing religious group, headed by Khomeini, emerge victorious and push the leftists out of Iran or kill them altogether. The government of Iran does have a president and a parliament today. I forget the name of the president of Iran offhand, but a while ago, not too long ago, it was President Mahmoud. But he since has left office. But the president, while he does have a lot of power, is more or less the secular figurehead of a traditional theocratic government headed by a group of men known as mullahs, who are Islamic clerics. And these clerics pretty much govern all aspects of Islamic life and Islamic law and Iranian life. There are secular elements that they are not involved in, but since all aspects of Islamic life are connected to certain secular aspects like trade and things like that, they have a say in virtually everything. The mullahs are in charge. American relations with the Iranian Revolution and this Islamic Iranian Republic come to a head in November of 1979, when revolutionaries, college students, and clerics broke into the United States Embassy in Iran and took most of the embassy staff and hostage, for 444 days between 1979 to 1981. The hostages were blindfolded. They were moved around from different safe houses, although many of them were housed in the embassy itself. They were not necessarily physically tortured, although some were. A few do die from various illnesses, but mainly they are subjected to psychological torture. An example of this would be, say, being kept in a dark room blindfolded, and then having men come in, yell at you while you were blindfolded, stand you up against a wall, hold a gun against your head, count down from 10 to 1, and then pull the trigger, but the gun would not be loaded. And this went on for 444 days. This is a picture of the students storming the American embassy during the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Now, the Americans will attempt to respond under Jimmy Carter. They freeze Iranian assets. They enact very harsh boycotts and trade restrictions there to bring the Iranian people to their knees. In many ways, this does work. It starves many Iranian people and drives the country into economic turmoil. But in order to get the Iranian hostages, the American hostages, out of Iran, Carter institutes a plan known as Operation Eagle Claw. And this is the first use or public use of what are called the Delta Force, who are handpicked from the United States Army to go in and be a specially trained special forces unit to quickly mobilize, infiltrate, and exfiltrate these hostages from the embassy. Unfortunately, this proves to be a very disastrous event and a disastrous debut for the Delta Force. Their helicopters are not built for this desert environment. They cannot tolerate the sands in their rotary blades. So they start having issues with helicopters. There are weather issues with high winds. They don't have very good intelligence on where all of the hostages are being held. And the helicopters, although they come at night, are seen and heard, and various Iranian militaries and militias are out to meet them. So a couple of helicopters crash, several servicemen are killed, and while most of the servicemen will escape, this is a disaster for the American military, the American image as a whole, and for the Carter administration. After the failure of Operation Eagle Claw, President Jimmy Carter and the President-elect Ronald Reagan enter into negotiations with the government of Iran to negotiate the release of these hostages. Now, most of this is attributed to Ronald Reagan, especially people like to romanticize the fact that Ronald Reagan publicly declared in his speech while he was running for office that he would not negotiate with the Iranian people and that he would bomb Iran until they released the hostages. I don't want to say that Ronald Reagan was a liar, but remember that Ronald Reagan was an actor and was a showman and was running for office. Ronald Reagan was very much inside and understood the very sensitive political strategies and political undertakings that were happening at this time. And he and Jimmy Carter were part of, although Jimmy Carter was the lead, Ronald Reagan was in on the meetings negotiating for the hostages released. And although Carter really inked the deal on this, they were released just after Reagan took office in 1981. Carter does claim credit for this, but so does Ronald Reagan, and he uses it to bolster his image and his reputation as the great communicator, which is what he is known as a U.S. president. He was the great communicator. He's also known as the Gipper, but he was the great communicator. I don't want to downplay Ronald Reagan's importance here. He certainly was very important behind closed doors, but make no mistake about it, the kind of romanticization that Jimmy Carter was a fool and Ronald Reagan came in and rolled up his sleeves and got the job done is a romanticization. All sides were very much involved in the negotiation of this, and both men did not want to negotiate with Iran. But after the collapse and fall of Operation Eagle Claw, they really had no choice. Now, there were several hostages left over before they were liberated in 1981 by negotiation. And that led us to what was referred to as the Canadian Caper. This was mainly spearheaded by the Canadian Intelligence Bureau, with great aid by the CIA and the British MI6 as well. And if you've seen the movie, you might be familiar with it, the movie Argo. The movie Argo mainly shows the American aspect of it, but it does note the Canadian contribution. Some said it downplays it, but I think it just shows just one aspect of it. You get a sense the Canadians are doing a lot more. And this is most famously done where Americans and Canadians developed the idea that to save these hostages that were able to escape when the embassy was stormed, there were hostages that saw what was about to happen, and they walked out the back door and found shelter in various other embassy houses around Tehran, being housed by the British and the Canadians. And so they were not being held, and the Iranians knew they were around, and they were trying to find them. And so in order to exfiltrate them, get them out of Iran, a false Hollywood corporation was created with offices in Hollywood, spearheaded by Canadians and Americans, and a phony picture referred to as Argo was dug up. A script, the script was real. Production really went into production. The script was optioned. Money was handed over. There was public records of this. They had studio space rented out, office spaces rented out. And this was all done to fool the Iranians into believing that these American agents and these Canadian agents and British agents all coming into Iran were actually Canadian filmmakers scouting locations for this Canadian science fiction film called Argo. And they were able to successfully leave with these American embassy workers, all disguised as Canadian filmmakers, to get them out. I highly recommend the movie Argo. Again, it has a lot of artistic liberties to it, but it is a very good film that kind of gets at the heart of the tension which was going on at this time. This concludes this first part of the two-part lecture on Iran. I will now transition to the final lecture in the next film, and that's where we're going to get into the much more muckier, much dirtier, much muddier relationship between the United States and Iran, Iran and Iraq, Iraq and the United States, and eventually the global war on terror. So enjoy the rest of your evening, and I look forward to seeing you when you open up the next video. Thank you.